Uh, Hello, Marie Esabel. Thank you so much for taking time out to meet with me today. I have a number of questions which I wanted to ask you in relation to your music and your activism and your views. And so let me start by asking this. Those who are familiar with your music know that you reflect deeply about violence against trans people, especially trans BIPOC people, but you also celebrate trans lives. Could you say a little about trans figures, whether music makers, activists, or writers, who you draw strength from as a trans BIPOC person, a chorister, and as a composer?
Absolutely. I think the broadest answer I can give is that because there is so much or so little visibility of trans people, we don't have a lot of success stories. There's a lot of emphasis on violence and murder, and the suffering of trans people. So I think when I see my friends, my personal friends that are transgender, as well as more well known figures, live prosperous lives and contribute something to society, that to me is already inspirational. I think a lot of Americans in general are living in survival mode. And it's certainly true of transgender Americans. There's so many like needs that are not met. And so you were asking me about specific people. And one of the pieces that I composed, it's called When the Dust Settles, is about a figure who I've never met. Her name is Miss Major Griffin Gracie, and she is considered a Stonewall veteran. So the Stonewall riots basically marked the beginning of the LGBTQ movement for justice or in liberation in the United States. And she was there in the time, but she spent her whole lifetime, she's a black trans woman. She spent her whole lifetime advocating for trans and intersex Americans. She's been thrown into prison in New York and has been involved in talks about prison reform. And I just think that she is a perfect example of somebody who's still living today and still advocating today, that lives in the intersection of being a black trans woman, and poverty, and addressing the specific adversities that we suffer, whether that's because us being trans or being poor or being a minority race in the United States. I have a whole other list. I don't know if you want me to go through everybody, but
Maybe we could talk about your top three.
okay. Well, I already mentioned Amir Rabia. They are a poet that I regularly collaborate with. I think I've set five of their poems, and at least two of them have been original poems, meaning they didn't exist before. They wrote the lyrics specifically for the piece that I was composing. Actually, the last commission I just finished was an Amir Rabia text. But Amir is, I believe, born in London, but they are a mixed race, transgender, disabled poet. They're also a librarian. They live in Pennsylvania and they're a librarian, but they're a prolific writer and instructor and mentor. And I literally would not have the career that I have if it wasn't for meeting Amir in 2015 to create Our Phoenix, which was my first collaboration with Amir. And I think Amir's words really they inspire beautiful music, and they inspire the singers who sing the music. And I think it's because, again, because of the intersections of being mixed race. I believe Amir is Syrian and Cherokee, which is a type of Native American, and um, and they're disabled, low income, non-binary trans. So I think all of those things, they're relevant because there's not much visibility and representation for that, but they're really relevant because, like Miss Major Griffin Gracie, there's specific truths that can be articulated by people who have grown to survive with these conditions. I like to say that trans people, we have perceptions, incorrect perceptions, and like pushed. It feels like physically pushed on our bodies, and I think that's something specific to trans people that we live with. And I think that, for example, the gender binary does oppress cisgender people in the same way, but for trans people, it's more it's harder to ignore. Another trans person that brings me a lot of hope that I've also met in person is named Brianna Sinclair, and she is pretty well known now. She is a Black transgender opera singer, and her story. If you look up interviews of her, you will find her whole story, and all of the adversities like homelessness and doing survival sex work to survive. She was my roommate whenever I was a graduate student. She was also in the beginning of her master's that same year. But we crossed, and she is now singing, training in soprano roles for operas, and she's just a huge source of inspiration for so many. I think what is most stands out to me the most about Brianna is that she has shown that there's limitations that are pushed onto trans bodies, and specifically with trans women, we are brought up to believe that our voices are always going to be male voices, that trans women can only be bass, baritone, or tenor. And Brianna just really shatters that perception because she sings soprano in a way that is clear. It's not like a countertenor. She's singing with a clear tone and resonance, and she can do basically what any cis woman who is a soprano opera singer can do. And I think that is really groundbreaking. Certainly for me, if I was a kid again, I I wouldn't believe that was possible.
Thank you for that. And I just want to apologize for my phone. The setting off just now. I was turning off the sound. I wasn't checking my message. Sorry about
It's
that.
okay. I feel like maybe I'm rambling a little bit. I'm sorry.
No, no, of course not. Um, Let me move on to my second question, which is I found your name on the Institute of Composer Diversity, where there's listed a total of 13 transgender composers, and it seems like you are the only BIPOC trans composer. Could you say more about being a trans BIPOC composer in a white cis male dominated field, and how do you relate to white trans composers?
There's so much to extract from here. That is a very deep and intertwined question. So to comment first on my race, it's not something that I was brought up to emphasize. I think very much in the past. So I'm 34 now. I'm about to turn 35, but only in the past 5 to 10 years has there been any, I guess I've become more curious about my own heritage and making that a point of pride, just because the more success I have in my career, the more I realize there aren't people of color, there aren't women, there certainly aren't trans people. So I feel a little bit like an alien whenever I physically go somewhere as a composer and people are performing my music and it's, being celebrated. And I just don't see a lot of people that look like me in those roles. But I would describe my race as being mixed race. I wouldn't have known if I didn't spit in a tube, but I have apparently 10% of African heritage in me, and I have 50% of indigenous Mexican percentage. And that part's not as surprising. But as I noted, this was something when I was being brought up that I was supposed to ignore. I think my parents really tried to protect us from what people might perceive for a Mexican family, certainly one pursuing multiple degrees. My family members are lower income and they have children at a younger age, they're less educated, they need financial assistance. Not to say that I don't need financial assistance, but I see even with my cousins that there's a class disparity as well, and that's maybe more associated with being a Mexican American. My father was the only person in his family to get a degree, and he became an attorney. My mom doesn't have a college education. My dad was discouraged from learning Spanish as a kid because if he had an accent, that he would have less opportunities because he speaks English with a Spanish accent. And my mom, her parents didn't speak English, so she was a translator in her family. And there's all of these stories about racism that my both of my parents grew up with, and I was not told those stories until I was an adult, very recently, because I finally asked. But I think what my point is that my brother and we were sheltered from that part of ourselves and that part of our family history. So I think, just to clarify, I'm asked to talk about race a lot in the context of classical music, but I myself have had to do work to learn about anti-blackness and rethink my own internalized anti-blackness. There's a lot to talk about there, but these are just conversations that people are starting to have now. And like I said, the more successful I become, the more I realize that I feel like an alien. I feel like I don't belong. The other important detail is that my education I would consider to be very white. I'm from suburbia in Texas, and I it was always very diverse growing up, and that was very normal for me. But I went to college in the Midwest, and it was more than predominantly white there. And excuse me, I gotta take a sip of water. The school I went to was St. Olaf College, And it's literally a liberal arts school that was founded by Norwegian immigrants. I had only one black professor, and I had technically had two Latino professors. But all of them, all three of them were men. And then I went to study in Paris, and of course that was mostly with other with white people, with more white professors. Excuse me. And and then I went to conservatory for my master's degree, and I studied under Nadia, not Nadia Boulanger, but a student of Nadia Boulanger. And so I think that, yeah, my education is more typical of a cisgender white person, usually male. And like I said, the more success I've had, the more I felt that way. Even going from undergraduate into my grad school, I was the only, I wasn't the only woman, but I was certainly the only Latina. And there were a couple of other women, but I believe they were from China. They weren't even from the United States. Um, and everybody else was like white. Um, I think there might have been one Latino, like a male student, and that was it. But the further up you go, the less diverse it gets. Um, I don't know if I answered your whole question. There's more I can talk about. You asked about how I compare with like other trans composers. Is that correct?
Yes, I was curious about how you relate to colleagues who were also trans, but who were white, and maybe they face a different kind of set of problems than you did.
Well, I think that those are two different things. The first thing to be said, though, is that I mean, I live in a place where they're trying to erase trans people. Certainly, if you're a kid, if you're a young person, they want to make it a crime for a doctor to treat you. I don't know how much you know about that, but it's it's very extreme, the transphobia. Whereas in other countries, the government literally pays for medical procedures. That's one of the things about being specifically a transgender American. But so what I'm trying to say is that trans people have to go to like a psychologist, get doctor's notes, do hormone therapy if they feel that that's something that they need, save money to get surgery if they feel that's something what they need. Not a lot of trans people. A lot of trans people don't require surgery. Some people do, and for those that do, it's not affordable. It's not very accessible. There aren't many surgeons, and you have to travel somewhere to go be treated, and you have to. So, for example, the surgery that most people talk about for trans women is bottom surgery, and that's anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 US. And so that's $20,000 to $30,000 US that I have to come up with on top of everything else. So what I'm trying to say is, and that's just medical. There's legal things like getting your documentation to match. My passport matches who I am, but my driver's license doesn't. So the state of Texas doesn't recognize me as a woman. So there's a whole bunch of homework that trans people have to do in order to enjoy a middle class life. Excuse me. In terms of race, I think that really just in classical music, but especially in choral music, that there's so little representation of specifically Latinos, but just people of color are woefully underrepresented in terms of like who the conductors are, who is getting the head positions at universities and colleges, and in terms of composers being performed. Um, I would I would comment for composers that even if you're a cisgender white composer, that it's hard to get performed because in choral music, as I would imagine in orchestral music to a degree, it's the music, they mostly program dead people. And so we could just talk about being a living composer and not being, performed, played, or sung. But yeah, it's just whenever you talk about race, when you talk about gender, and when you talk about gender identity, being transgendered, those are just like more reasons for me to be lower on your list or not on your radar at all. Um, and I say that fully recognizing that in the past years, people have been making, in the recent years, people have been making an effort. And I've noticed the change personally. And I appreciate that because I have more of a platform and more people are performing my music. So I think things are changing, but I don't know. If you're a choir director and your entire program is of dead composers, the, that needs to be looked at.
Okay. Excuse me. Um, my next question is there's a perception in music studies that Western art music is the music of white people, which we talked about. And people tend to think that the best way to decenter that is to focus on traditional musics from other geographies. But not everyone thinks this way. It's possible that this attitude might end up erasing BIPOC music makers who are within Western art music, like yourself. And I would say that there's really no equivalence between the music of white cis male composers versus QT BIPOC composers because your life experiences are so radically different. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's important to look at race with a grain of salt. So what I mean by that is, if you're a white person from California and you're brought up in an Asian community, an East Asian community, maybe specifically Chinese, you're going to have some familiarity with that. And maybe you'll have more familiarity with that than what is typical of a Midwestern white person from the United States. Do you understand what I'm saying? The cultural references that we are brought up with, specifically in the United States, since depending where you are, there's a great mix of people. But it can be a lot of different things. It might be that a white person is more familiar with traditional Chinese music, for example, than somebody like a Chinese person from the Midwest who's grown up not knowing anything Chinese. So that's sort of where we are. What is not okay is whenever that Chinese person from the Midwest grows up and becomes a composer and says, somebody tells him, of course I want to commission your music, but can you write something Chinese? When it really should just be, I'm so excited to hire you because Chinese people are very underrepresented in the composers that we perform. And I'm going to commission you to write a piece of music that you're passionate about, something that you want to write, regardless of whether that's tied to a tradition or not. So I think we need to talk about race with a grain of salt and that reason. And when I reflected on your question earlier, I mentioned this resource online called the Non-Idiomatic Music of Black Composers. a friend of mine named Dr. Marcus Garrett from the University of Nebraska Lincoln. Again, Midwest United States. Um, so Marcus Garrett is actually a composer himself, but he created, in his research, he's been focused on specifically Black composers, but the music that is non-idiomatic of Black composers, meaning music that isn't necessarily like American spirituals or gospel music. Anything that is considered Black music in a choral context. If they're writing something in Spanish, or if they're writing something that it is not particular to any race or any history of anybody's race. Just because somebody is Black doesn't mean that the music that they write is just for Black people or is a comment on Black culture. And of course, I've said Chinese and Black, and I'm not even talking about my own experience. But as I was mentioning earlier, I think for people who are mostly indigenous blood or who have half indigenous blood, it's like we've been cut off from our history. That's just the history of the United States. And, to an extent, other countries, in my case, it would be Mexico, but, indigenous people's culture and language has been, you know, destroyed mostly. So I guess in that sense, that anything that I compose, even if it's in Spanish, is not really reflective of my race. So I think this word non-idiomatic is very helpful just to be more precise when we're talking about the music that people are composing.
And for readers or viewers rather who are interested, there will be a link to the website for the non-idiomatic music of Black composers included in the description for this YouTube video. And I also want to say that I appreciate you bringing me into the conversation with the East Asian example, which is kind of on point because there are a lot of West Coast composers who kind of grew up with the sounds of Chinese music around them. Whereas with the music education that was offered in Singapore, where I grew up, my whole exposure to Chinese music was one concert of a Chinese orchestra, of the Chinese orchestra that I was exposed to. So you were kind of exactly like 100% accurate on that. Um, so thank you for that. And let me move on now to the next question, which is I want to talk a little bit about our Phoenix, which is your composition from 2016. But before I do that, I'm going to play a short excerpt and then I'll ask my next question. So I'm just going to do a quick share screen so that the viewers can see this. We can figure out how to share screen. Ah, um, And for viewers who are interested, there will also be a link in the description for this YouTube video if you want to listen to the whole piece, and I strongly encourage everyone to do that. So, my question is related to transgender identity. There are a lot of writers who look for fluidity in the music of trans composers, thinking that this is a reflection of how transgender people negotiate more than one gender role. But trans composers like Wendy Carlos have also in the past spoken out against this. They prefer writers to just focus on your music. There are some researchers who might be tempted to read the fluidity of B flat minor and D flat major in Our Phoenix, even in just the short excerpt that we heard, and they might read the whole aspect of the journey from one key to the other as a reflection of transgender subjectivity. What are your thoughts on this?
I would tend to agree categorically with Wendy Carlos, that, I'm not trying to be a trans composer. I'm not trying to show my being transgender in my music. It's just that I am a transgender composer, and this is the music that I'm writing. I write the music that people pay me to compose, and I don't really think of my handling of tonality or harmony to be influenced by my gender identity at all. But I mean, maybe whenever I die, after many musicologists have looked into it, maybe there's something there, but that's not really the intention that I have. I think what's more interesting about our Phoenix is the words and the poet who is Amir Rabia, a trans poet, speaking of the resilience of the transgender community.
Thank you. Um, my next question is, many of the other transgender and non-binary composers I've come across on the Institute of Composer Diversity website write music that adheres to some of these labels: avant-garde, experimental, modernist. The contemporary choral movement in general, on the other hand, has often practiced tonality. I was a choral singer myself and I loved this repertoire, but music scholars are often unfamiliar with it. And I think music research has tended to identify itself with the revolutionary ethos of modernism. What are your thoughts about this?
I think this is one of the reasons why I understand that getting a terminal degree, a doctoral degree in music composition, is probably not for me. Um, I don't know why scholars have decided to put so much emphasis on atonal music. Um, I'm not really interested in policing what music is and what is not worthy for scholars to study or to emphasize. And in that sense, I guess my music is more traditional or conservative because it is tonal. Um, I also, you want to consider the choir as a medium. In my notes, I wrote down that chorus it's for the people. It's music of the people, and what I mean by that is the people that are singing in a choir aren't going to necessarily sit down and sight read Friede auf Erden by Schoenberg or Ligeti or anything by Ligeti or like Bellio Tormes. It takes people with a certain amount of education and musical literacy to be able to deliver those pieces. And mostly choirs are not doing that. Mostly choirs are consistent of people who have a medium level of music education. Most people who are in choir don't have a degree in music. Um, but most people in choir love choir and they love to sing, and it brings so much meaning to their lives. And that's what I mean of the people. I think there's also a comment to be made. I cannot make it very articulately, but I'm thinking of a colleague of mine named Ahmed Ansaldua, who is an Egyptian Mexican American. Well, I don't think he's a United States citizen, but he lives in Minnesota. And he would talk about how choir has been historically a part of political movements. And I think that there's something really significant and powerful about choral music because it is not so posh, if I can say that. And you can almost say the same thing that about music that is not super rhythmically complex or at a really high tempo. I think when you talk about a symphony orchestra set reading a piece of music, you know, even if it's a youth orchestra, these are humans who have had lessons. And when you look at a choir, you know, put your finger on a map anywhere in the United States, the people in that choir may not even know how to read music. So I think that's, you know, when we talk about new music and trying to show off, you know, what you can do as a composer, it doesn't make sense to write lots of, you know, asymmetric meter or metrical changes in choral music, unless you're like for a very specific reason, you know. It doesn't make the music bad. What I'm saying is that that type of music is not accessible widely. And I think choral music is generally supposed to be accessible widely.
Uh, and I'll add that I absolutely don't think that your music is traditional or conservative at all. I think even though you may speak the same tonal language, the music written by a contemporary trans BIPOC composer is just not the same as a tonal piece written by a white cis male composer from a few centuries ago. That's what I think. Um, my next question is, um, I've come across some of the previous interviews you did and was curious about your experiences with them. What do you see as a successful or unsuccessful interview?
Um, I think in 2022 we've moved beyond this, but a lot of times, actually, we haven't moved beyond it because I did an interview earlier this year where I had to answer some of these questions. But anytime you are interviewing a trans person and asking them about their transition, how did you know you were transgender? Have you had surgery? When did you have surgery? Um, you know, or something about focusing on transgender suffering. So many trans women, so many women, period, but so many trans women are survivors of sexual violence. Um, you know, we can talk about those things, but I'd prefer people to talk about my music. And, you know, if I wasn't a composer, if I was, you know, an actor, I would want somebody to discuss the movies that I was playing in or the theater productions that I was participating in. I there's so much more interesting things to talk about rather than my body and my suffering. And I think that that's what you should not do. And obviously, that's not what you're doing right now. But I think that's really where people can kind of get derailed. If you're interviewing somebody trans, you need to stay focused. And if people do have questions about those things, then you can Google it. Or maybe buy me dinner first, and then I'll tell you.
Um, I do have one last question, but let me first of all thank you for educating me and educating the viewers about how to talk about trans people and trans BIPOC composers and how not to talk about trans BIPOC composers. Um, and I want to end with this question. Could you tell us more about how we can support you as a BIPOC trans woman?
I think the most obvious thing is that I'm saving up money to have bottom surgery myself, and once I turned 30, I started a GoFundMe. So that's something that I should mention. Besides that, listen to my music. If it resonates with you, perform my music, record my music, publish my music. I am just like all the other composers trying to, build a career from the work that I love to do. And so, even if you just go and listen to some of my music and think about it, like that, I appreciate that. I think that the music that I write is a little different, not in the sense that it's tonal or that it's better than other music, but in the sense that the stories that I'm trying to tell and the people that I collaborate with tend to be from a lens that is from an underrepresented person, a marginalized person, a minoritized person, because it's really what I've been focused on. I think it's a responsibility for composers to have curiosity and to strive to tell these stories that maybe people have not heard or that would make people uncomfortable but need to be told so that we have a deeper understanding of each other.
And I want to let viewers know that there will be a link in the description for this YouTube video to the GoFundMe for Mari Esabel. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I learned so much. And I just wanted to say that I absolutely love your music, especially our Phoenix, and I encourage listeners to enjoy this music and to program it. And it really is music for the soul. And thank you so much for your music and your activism and everything that you do for the trans BIPOC community and other marginalized people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.